Welcome to this journey into one of the most unsettling cases ever whispered about in the Missouri Ozarks. As you listen, imagine the place you are in right now, the time glowing on your screen or clock, and how far these words have traveled to reach you. Different towns, different countries, different nights, all connected by one cold, forgotten story from 1912. It began with almost nothing, just a few short lines in the Springfield Republican that winter. A tiny notice, buried deep in the paper, easy to miss and easier to forget. It reported a family disturbance. In Taney County, out in the rough backcountry of the Ozark Mountains, a woman named Eliza Whitlock had supposedly left her home near the White River. Her husband, Thomas Whitlock, told authorities that after a quarrel, she had walked away from her life and simply never come back. The item ended with a single, chilling idea disguised as routine. No further investigation was necessary. On paper, it was nothing extraordinary. People left families. People disappeared. The hills of the Ozarks were full of men and women who had chosen to vanish. But what the newspaper did not print was that this quiet little paragraph was the first visible crack in a story that would take 40 years to surface. A story of isolation, madness, buried truth, and a woman who tried desperately to escape her own home. The Whitlock homestead sat on about 40 rocky acres of hillside near the small settlement of Walnut Shade, around 15 miles south of Forsyth, the Taney County seat. The land was rough oak and pine climbing the slopes, limestone bluffs cutting into the sky, deep hollows filling with shadow long before the sun was gone. On this ground stood a 2-story timber frame house, a small barn and scattered outbuildings where tools, animals, and secrets could all be hidden away from curious eyes. County records show that in 1908, Thomas Whitlock bought this property after leaving Springfield, where he'd worked as a clerk at Heer's department store. On paper, he was described as quiet, orderly, and particular in his habits. His wife, Eliza Whitlock, had been a schoolteacher in Christian County before their marriage in 1905, educated, disciplined, and by all accounts, devoted to her work and later to her children. By 1912, they had 2 of them, Edward, 6 years old, and Mary, 4. Neighbors remembered the Whitlocks as distant but not unfriendly. They did not attend church socials regularly, rarely stayed to gossip after trips into town. Thomas would sometimes be seen riding into Forsyth or Branson for supplies. Eliza, however, was almost never spotted beyond the borders of her own land after their first year there. At the time, this wasn't unusual. In that region, homesteads were often separated by miles of rock, trees, and silence. A family could go weeks, even months, without so much as seeing another face. The Ozarks had long been a refuge for people who wanted to disappear from the law, from debts, from old lives they no longer wanted. In that setting, solitude was normal, privacy was expected, and behind closed doors anything could happen, according to Joseph Miller, whose family owned the neighboring property to the east. The Whitlocks seemed reasonably content in those early years. Miller would later recall that Thomas was particular about his land boundaries, but not overtly hostile, a man who would give a curt nod as he passed on the trail. Eliza, he said, was even more reserved, keeping her eyes low and her words brief, yet the children looked healthy, clean, and properly dressed whenever he saw them. But in the fall of 1911, something changed. Miller noticed that Thomas began improving the property in ways that didn't quite match what other homesteaders were doing. He started digging what looked like a new root cellar behind the house, only deeper, narrower, and oddly shaped. At the same time, he began adding extra locks and reinforcements to the doors. At first, this could be explained away. Winter was coming. People in the Ozarks took harsh weather seriously. But in hindsight, those changes would take on a more sinister meaning. The last time anyone outside the family could say with certainty that they saw Eliza Whitlock alive was in November 1911. A midwife from Walnut Shade, Harriet Bowman, rode out to the homestead after receiving word that Eliza was unwell. Bowman later described what she found. The house was strangely cold, even though the fireplace was burning, and Eliza looked pale, distracted, and nervous, not obviously sick, but hollowed out in some way that was hard to name. What unnerved Bowman most was not Eliza, but Thomas. He stayed in the room for the entire visit, answering questions directed at his wife before she could speak, watching every word. When Bowman suggested that Eliza might need a doctor in Forsyth, Thomas cut her off, saying they couldn't afford it and that rest would be enough. Around the same time, bank records from the Taney County Bank show that Thomas had begun making regular withdrawals from the family's modest savings. Between September and December 1911, he removed nearly half of everything they had. When the bank manager, Harold Winters, asked about it, Thomas explained that he was paying for home improvements and winter preparations. That made sense on the surface, until you remembered that the Whitlocks were not a wealthy family, and that the amounts being withdrawn were far beyond what most homesteaders spent to get through the cold months. Then came the winter of 1911-1912, a season so brutal the weather reports from the Springfield Bureau still read like a warning: temperatures near zero, snow piling up and refusing to melt for weeks. Remote homesteads such as the Whitlocks were cut off almost entirely. Paths turned to ice, streams froze. The world shrank to the boundaries of your own land and whatever light your lantern could throw into the dark. It was during this period of isolation, sometime between late February and early March 1912, that Eliza supposedly left. No one saw her go. No one heard a wagon on the road or footsteps through the snow. No one in Walnut Shade met her on the way to town. Her departure existed only in the words of one man, her husband. In late March, Joseph Miller happened to meet Thomas on the road to Forsyth. When he casually inquired after the family, Thomas said only, "The missus has gone away." No explanation, no tears, no anger. Just a flat statement dropped into the cold spring air and left there. Miller, used to minding his own business like everyone else in those hills, did not push for details. On March 4th, ledgers from the general store in Forsyth show that Thomas came to town and bought an unusually large amount of preserved food, coffee, and lamp oil, enough to keep a household going for weeks without another trip. The store owner, Jeremiah Collins, wrote in his private journal that Thomas seemed agitated and unwilling to indulge in the usual brief pleasantries. When Collins politely asked about Mrs. Whitlock, Thomas snapped, "She is not my concern at present. In another place, in another time, that might have been enough to spark alarm." In the remote Ozarks of 1912, it was just another uneasy moment in a culture where a man's home was his fortress, and outsiders rarely crossed the line between concern and interference. For the moment, Eliza's absence was a private mystery, contained within 40 acres of cold earth, a locked house, and 2 frightened children who knew more than they dared to say. While the hills around Walnut Shade were still locked in late winter ice, someone far away began to feel that something was very wrong at the Whitlock homestead. That person was Catherine Crawford, Eliza's older sister, living in Springfield. For years, Eliza's letters had been Catherine's only window into that isolated valley. At first they were detailed, full of descriptions of the children, the house, and the struggle of making a life on rocky Ozark soil. Over time, though, those letters had grown shorter and less frequent. By the autumn of 1911, they had become careful, guarded, with whole thoughts left unfinished. Then eventually they stopped altogether. Winter came and went, no letter, no postcard, no word sent through a neighbor. At first Catherine tried to explain it away. Bad weather, poor roads, sickness, the business of farm life. But by early April 1912, the silence had become unbearable. Eliza might be many things, Catherine thought, but she was not careless about her children. She would not simply fall quiet without reason. Unable to shake her unease, Catherine wrote to the postmaster at Walnut Shade, asking if anything was known about her sister. The reply that came back was short and devastating. It was commonly said that Mrs. Whitlock had left her family. No details, no forwarding address, no explanation. Just the flat, matter-of-fact idea that a wife and mother had walked away. That was the moment Catherine decided to go to Taney County herself. Her journal, later donated by her granddaughter, captures the fear that drove her. "I cannot believe that Eliza would leave her children willingly. Her letters had grown so careful, so unlike her, But of one thing I am certain, she loved those children. Something is terribly wrong in those hills. Once in Forsyth, Catherine went straight to Sheriff James Harmon and pleaded for an investigation. She was not hysterical. She came with dates, letters, and the stubborn certainty you hear only in the voice of someone who knows their loved one to the core. Harmon finally agreed to ride out to the Whitlock homestead. His official report, dated April 18, 1912, reads like a routine welfare check. He wrote that he found the property in good order, the house standing, the barn intact, the yard reasonably maintained. Thomas and both children were present. Edward and Mary appeared adequately fed and clothed, though he noted they were unusually quiet. Thomas told a simple story. According to him, Eliza had grown dissatisfied with their isolated life. After a disagreement, she had packed some personal items and left of her own free will. He claimed not to know where she had gone, but suggested she might have returned to Springfield. Catherine insisted she had not. Neither she nor Eliza's parents had heard a word. Harmon walked through the house. No overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle. Eliza's clothes and belongings seemed to be missing from the drawers and wardrobe, as if she really had packed a trunk or valise. On paper, this supported Thomas's story. No blood, no broken objects, no clear evidence of violence. In the end, the sheriff concluded that there was no proof of foul play. Eliza, as an adult woman, had the legal right to leave her husband and children if she chose to do so. With heavy reluctance, and without any legal footing to demand more, Catherine had to accept this official answer. The case was quietly closed before it ever truly began. But that was only what went into the report. After Sheriff Harmon's death in 1931, his personal notebook was found among his papers. Inside was a very different account of that visit. In his private hand, he wrote that Thomas was too composed for a man recently abandoned. The children, he noted, watched their father's face before answering any question, even the simplest ones. At one point, Edward started to speak about his mother, then fell silent the instant Thomas cleared his throat. Harmon had also noticed something else. Behind the house, the earth had been recently turned, forming a narrow, elongated patch of disturbed soil. Thomas told him it was a future garden plot, though it was the wrong time of year for planting, and the shape was more like a trench than a bed of vegetables. In that private notebook, Harmon admitted his unease. He suspected Thomas might be hiding something, but he had no body, no witness, and no law that would justify digging up a man's yard on nothing more than a sister's fear and a sheriff's instincts. Without a body or a witness, there is no crime to investigate, he wrote. In these hills, family matters are considered private, and our county has neither the money nor the appetite for chasing ghosts. Catherine left Taney County with her questions unanswered. She did not stop caring, but the law and the culture of the time had drawn a hard line she could not cross. Back in Springfield, she tried to stay connected to Edward and Mary. She sent letters and small gifts, hoping at least to be a distant presence in their lives. The replies she received were stiff, formal notes in Thomas's handwriting, giving little detail and never allowing the children to speak for themselves on paper. In June 1912, Catherine made one more attempt. She traveled again to the Whitlock homestead, this time to see the children directly. Thomas met her at the door and refused to let her inside. He told her that her visits were disruptive to the household routine and that the children did not need outside influence. There was no scene, no violence, just a door held firmly between an aunt who worried and a father who would not let her in. Her final journal entry about the matter, dated July 3, 1912, reads, "I fear I have failed Eliza. Without proof or standing, I cannot force my way into that house or rescue the children. If she lives, she is beyond my reach. If she is dead, the truth lies buried with her. I can only pray that someday, in some way, this wrong will be brought to light." The world moved on. The sheriff closed his file. The neighbors went back to their fields. Life in Taney County continued, with the Whitlock homestead still sitting in its narrow valley, hemmed in by trees and stone. To most people, the case of Eliza Whitlock was already over. A wife who grew tired of her hard life and slipped away into the wider world. A sad story perhaps, but not a crime. Only Catherine, a troubled sheriff, and two silent children knew that something in that story did not ring true. After Catherine Crawford left Taney County in July 1912, the Whitlock homestead slipped back into silence. Whatever had happened inside that house, whatever truth lay beneath Thomas Whitlock's flat explanations, was now sealed behind wooden walls, a father's authority, and the distance of miles of forested hills. Life on the property did not stop. It tightened. That summer, a local woman named Martha Jenkins began working part-time at the Whitlock home, coming a few days a week to help with housework and the children. She was one of the few outsiders who crossed the Whitlock threshold after Eliza's disappearance, and what she saw stayed locked in her memory until she was an old woman. In 1952, 40 years later, she would tell investigators that Thomas had given her strict instructions the first day she arrived. Do not discuss Mrs. Whitlock with the children. Do not allow them to ask questions. Say only that Mother will return when she is better. She said Thomas delivered these orders in a calm, unchanging voice, but with an edge that made obedience feel less like a suggestion and more like a warning. Teach Plessis no Onakul Gio Jenkins later recalled that several areas of the property were completely forbidden. Thomas told her to avoid the back of the house, especially the area near the root cellar he had built the previous fall. The tools are dangerous, he said. They could hurt the children. But Jenkins noticed something strange. The door to the cellar was always locked, and Thomas carried the key on his person. Even when he was inside the house, he kept it in his pocket, touching it unconsciously, as if checking again and again that nothing had escaped from behind that wooden door. One morning, she saw young Mary walking too close to the cellar entrance. Thomas reacted instantly, grabbing the girl's arm so sharply that she cried out. He apologized later, but Jenkins said she could not get the image out of her mind. A small child frightened not by danger she could see, but by the fear written on her father's face. Man mum ashes. The more Jenkins worked there, the more she felt that something dark pressed down over that house. She said Thomas seemed to be fighting a battle no one else could see. He rarely slept. Many mornings when she arrived, he was already at the kitchen table, staring at the window as if he expected someone or something to appear. He muttered to himself in low, trembling phrases, keeping watch, maintaining the barriers. They can't get in if the walls hold. When Jenkins asked if he was feeling well, he brushed her off. But she began to suspect the truth. Whatever had happened to Eliza had not brought Thomas peace. It had only deepened his fear, sharpening it until it consumed him. Tishu dark CDDOS. By 1913, both Edward and Mary began attending the one-room schoolhouse in Walnut Shade. Their teacher, Abigail Thornton, kept a private diary, one that would later become an essential piece of the puzzle. She described both children as unusually quiet and withdrawn. Edward especially. He sat in class with dark circles under his eyes, his small hands folded tightly in his lap. When Thornton gently asked why he looked so tired, he whispered, "The noises kept me awake." When she asked what noises he meant, he lowered his head and refused to answer. Thornton soon realized that both children became visibly tense whenever anyone mentioned their mother. One day in October 1913, a female visitor came to the schoolhouse and casually asked Mary if her mama would be attending the harvest social. Mary's face went pale. Her small hands shook. Later that afternoon, Thomas stormed into the schoolhouse, removed both children without explanation, and kept them home for nearly 2 weeks. Thornton's diary contains page after page of unsettling observations, Edward staring at the floor as if he heard something beneath it, Mary drawing strange pictures of a person underground, flowers sprouting above, the children flinching at loud noises, even when unexpected. But the detail that haunted Thornton came in the spring of 1914. Usich's Stigil DGG. Edward had suffered occasional spells in class, moments where he froze, staring at nothing, unresponsive. But one day the boy broke his silence. Thornton wrote, "Today Edward entered into one of his episodes. His lips moved as though forming words. I leaned close and heard him whisper, "She's still digging." When school ended that day, Thornton gathered her courage and visited the Whitlock homestead to discuss the matter. Thomas met her at the door. She tried to speak gently about Edward's distress, but Thomas's expression hardened. He told her that his children's private matters were not for the school to interfere with. He warned her not to question them again. Then he ended the conversation by saying that education was a privilege he controlled, and that he would remove the children entirely if she persisted. Thornton left the property with shaking hands and the overwhelming sense that she had witnessed something profoundly wrong, but had no power whatsoever to change it. For the next 3 years, the Whitlocks lived in that narrow valley as if cut off from the world. Thomas rarely spoke to neighbors. The children grew quieter, and the cellar door remained firmly locked season after season. Then, in 1917, when the school board finally started asking questions, when someone in authority finally pressed Thomas about the welfare of his children, he did the only thing he could do to keep the past buried. He sold the homestead, cheaply, and left. The Whitlocks vanished from Taney County just as suddenly as Eliza had. But the truth they fled from remained behind, buried under the cold ground of a forgotten cellar, waiting for the day when someone would finally disturb the earth again. When the spring rains of 1917 finally softened the Ozark soil, the Whitlock family disappeared from Taney County without farewell, without explanation, and without ceremony. One day their homestead was occupied, the next it stood silent, a house with curtains drawn and doors locked tight. Thomas sold the property in a single day, accepting far less than its value. To neighbors, it looked like a man in a hurry, someone who needed to escape before questions caught up with him. To the few who remembered Eliza, it felt like someone trying to outrun a ghost. Tichinundio Dumanidih Nagian Unas, as the buyer was James Harker, a cattle rancher from across the Arkansas border. From the moment he stepped onto the Whitlock land, he sensed something was wrong. The house felt abandoned, but not peacefully so. There were no signs of a family who had left in order. A missing plate here, a child's toy left in the yard, a window nailed shut for no good reason. Still, Harker and his family moved in and set about repairing what years of neglect and something darker had left behind. One of the first tasks was dealing with the strange root cellar behind the house. It had partially collapsed under its own weight, leaving a jagged dip in the earth like a mouth trying to close around something buried inside. Harker decided to tear it down and rebuild it properly. But when he began the demolition, he realized the cellar wasn't built like any other he'd seen. It was too deep, too narrow, divided by strange interior walls, as though someone had tried to section the underground space into separate, cramped chambers. And then came the discovery that haunted him for the rest of his life. Teach 2 feet beneath the floor of the collapsed cellar, Harker uncovered a woman's hairbrush, its wooden handle worn smooth, its dark bristles still tangled with strands of human hair. He paused when he saw it. Something in his chest tightened. But he was a practical man, trained by hard seasons and harder land not to jump to conclusions. He told himself it was only trash, something discarded long before his time. He dropped it aside and kept digging, but he never forgot the feeling that ran through him when he saw it, a thin, cold thread of unease winding itself into his thoughts. Years later, when investigators would ask about the cellar, Harker's son William recalled his father telling him that the structure felt wrong from the first blow of the hammer. Too deep, too deliberate, too secret. But in 1917, there was no investigation, no diary, no reason to imagine what lay beneath the dirt, except a stubborn whisper that the ground was hiding something. The Harker family kept the property until 1933, when the Great Depression forced them to sell. After that, the homestead passed through several owners. None stayed long. The land seemed to carry a heaviness that settled on anyone who tried to live there. By the time 1950 arrived, the original house had been abandoned entirely, windows broken, roof sagging, wind creeping through gaps in the walls like a voice that didn't belong. Local teenagers used the place as a dare. They whispered stories of a woman crying at night, of footsteps behind the house, of digging sounds rising from the earth, even when no one was near. Most folks dismissed these tales as superstition, the kind that clung to old Ozark places like vines. But the land had a memory, and the ground never forgets what's been buried in it. Tit feminodud echo yifoar akuyudite in 1952. A couple from St. Louis, Walter and Ruth Simmons, bought the abandoned property with plans to turn it into a hunting lodge. They thought the location was perfect, remote, scenic, untouched. But on their second day clearing brush behind the ruined house, fate intervened. The edge of a rusted metal rake struck something solid in the collapsed earth. The Simmonses pulled away vines, soil, and stone until a gap in the old cellar foundation revealed itself. Inside, wedged between two limestone blocks, was a small, rotting leather-bound object. A book, a diary, its pages water-damaged, its ink blurred, but still alive with handwriting. The name inside the front cover was just barely visible under the stain of time. Ruth later said that the moment she opened the diary, the air around her felt colder, as if the land itself exhaled, as if a story that had waited 4 decades in silence had just begun to speak again. A story about fear, a story about madness, a story about a woman who wrote her last words while someone dug beneath her floorboards. And a story that was finally ready to be heard when Walter and Ruth Simmons pried open the collapsed stones of the old root cellar in 1952 and found the water-damaged diary wedged between 2 limestone blocks. They unknowingly opened a door that had been sealed for 40 years. Ruth later said she knew immediately that the book was important, not because of the name inside, Eliza Whitlock, but because of the handwriting itself. The early entries were neat and carefully spaced. The later ones trembled across the page like someone writing in the dark or in fear or while being watched. The diary was turned over to Sheriff William Masterson, who began a renewed investigation. What he and the Simmons found within those fragile, half-rotted pages would become one of the most disturbing first-hand accounts ever recovered from the Ozark frontier. THTCGNS so far, Eliza's earliest entries from 1910 and 1911 were simple records of daily life, weather observations, notes about the children, mentions of canning peaches or mending clothes, but gradually small cracks of unease began to appear. In August 1911, she wrote, "T watches constantly. He says the house is not secure enough. He speaks of dangers I cannot see." Another entry from October 3, 1911, chilled investigators. "The children may not wander beyond the yard now. T has nailed shut our bedroom window. He says it is to keep out the cold, but the frost has not come." These were not the words of a woman planning to run away. They were the words of a woman beginning to fear her husband. T Vesachatpuda Nantanelp in November 1911, when midwife Harriet Bowman visited the homestead, Eliza wrote about the visit the moment Bowman left. "I wanted to speak freely, but could not. He stood beside me the entire time." And then the line that investigators would return to again and again. When she left, T said, "No one else will enter this house." Isolation was no longer an accident of geography. It was enforced. Tichi Rom beat Tichi Foor. By December, the entries grew shorter and more frantic. Thomas had been working on what he called a new room under the house, what others later identified as the root cellar. Eliza wrote, "The new room beneath the house is nearly finished. T works on it when he thinks I am asleep. He calls it a sanctuary." Those words would become horrifyingly literal. The killed Rembigi and Amanu in January 1912. Eliza described an incident that investigators found especially disturbing. "This morning Edward stood at the cellar door, staring down. He said, 'Father told them we will all sleep there soon when the time comes.'" When she confronted Thomas, he erupted in rage, then refused to leave her side for the rest of the day, as if afraid she would run or reveal a secret. As winter deepened, Eliza's entries took a desperate turn. She wrote that Thomas had begun preparing a tonic he insisted she drink each night. "It leaves me groggy and confused the next day. I pour it into my potted plant when he isn't looking. The plant died within days." This was the first sign that Thomas may have been drugging her, a fact later supported by the presence of sedative compounds found in her preserved tissue samples. Teachy last Monday, February, Eliza was openly terrified. Snow trapped them on the property. Thomas hid her boots and coat. The nights were filled with strange noises. She wrote, "I must get the children away." But how? We are miles from town, the snow is deep. T has hidden my things. Her second to last entry was only one sentence. He is digging again. Th Final NTR. The last readable page of the diary, dated February 17, 1912, contained only 3 lines. The handwriting was broken, jagged, almost illegible. He found these pages tonight. His rage was terrible. I hear him digging again. After that, the diary goes blank. No signature, no closing words, just silence. Within days, perhaps even hours, Eliza Whitlock was dead. The diary was the first unfiltered voice of what had truly happened in that isolated house. It showed a woman slowly cut off from the outside world, trapped in a winter that offered no escape, married to a man whose mind had turned dangerous. But the diary was only a beginning. It was the first light. The next step was to confirm where Eliza's body had been hidden all those years. And just a week after reading the final entry, Sheriff Masterson ordered an excavation of the cellar site. The discovery of Eliza's diary in 1952 was enough to reopen a case that had been cold for 40 years. But only one thing could confirm what investigators feared most. Sheriff William Masterson ordered an excavation of the old root cellar, the structure Thomas Whitlock had built during the months when Eliza's diary entries grew increasingly frightened. On June 18, 1952, a small team of deputies, a county labor crew, and the medical examiner arrived at the abandoned Whitlock homestead. The house was barely standing. Vines clawed the walls, the roof sagged inward, and the cellar entrance had collapsed long ago, stones scattered like broken teeth in the dirt. But beneath that ruin, something waited. TPITCC artwork began early in the morning. By noon, the men had cleared the remaining debris and exposed the old foundation stones. Then, just as they began lifting out a section of packed soil near the back wall, a deputy shovel struck something solid. It made a hollow, unmistakable sound, a sound that froze every man present. They cleared the soil with their hands, slowly, carefully, and when the first shape emerged, an arm, thin, bound with rusted wire, no one spoke for nearly a full minute. The remains of a woman lay just beneath the cellar floor. Her body had been placed face down. Her wrists were tied behind her back. The bones showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. There was no question. This was Eliza Whitlock, T.O.P.S.Y. Lawrence Wilson, the county medical examiner, transported the remains to Springfield for examination. His findings were stark and devastating. Eliza had been approximately 32 years old, consistent with her age in 1912. She had suffered a severe blow to the head, likely the cause of death. Her body showed evidence of binding, confirming she had not died willingly or peacefully. In preserved tissue samples, protected by the cold, alkaline Ozark soil, Dr. Wilson found traces of a sedative compound. This matched Eliza's diary entries describing a tonic that left her dizzy and confused. But one detail chilled the investigators more than all the others. Dr. Wilson found evidence of a previously healed fracture in her left wrist, an injury never recorded in any medical notes. It suggested that violence in the Whitlock home may have begun long before Eliza realized the danger she was in. Once the body was identified, Sheriff Masterson began tracing the fates of Thomas and the children. What he uncovered was a tragic web of lies and silence. Thomas Whitlock had died in Kansas City in 1931 from pneumonia. He never faced justice. Edward, the son who whispered, "She's still digging," enlisted in World War II and died in combat in 1944. Only Mary, now living in Omaha under the name Mary Coleman, was still alive. When authorities contacted her, Mary claimed she remembered nothing about her mother's disappearance. Her father had always told her that Eliza abandoned the family, and she said she had accepted that story. But the truth had never really left her. Not completely. Her husband contacted investigators privately, explaining that Mary suffered from recurring nightmares, screaming about a woman, calling from the floor, and that she had an overwhelming fear of basements, dirt floors, enclosed spaces, and the sound of digging. TPICHLG investigators later obtained Mary's childhood drawings from her attic after her death in 1968. The pictures were crude, drawn when she was 5 to 8 years old, but unmistakable small stick figures stood above a patch of earth. Beneath them, a woman lay buried, eyes open. Above it, a child had written, "Mama sleeping." A psychologist who analyzed the drawings wrote, "These images are not fantasies. They are memories a child was too young to understand, but too traumatized to forget." A fart sale NC Satter the excavation confirmed what Eliza had feared in her final diary entries, that Thomas had discovered her writing, had descended further into paranoia, and in a final act of madness, had murdered his wife and buried her beneath the room he called a sanctuary. For 40 years, her grave had lain undisturbed while her children played, slept, and tried to grow up above it. For 40 years, the Ozark ground had held its silence, and in 1952, when the truth finally rose to the surface, it came not like a revelation, but like a confession the land itself had been waiting to release. With Eliza's remains recovered, and her diary finally telling the story she never lived to speak aloud, Taney County faced a truth that had slept beneath its soil for 4 decades. But the end of the official investigation was not the end of the Whitlock case. Instead, it marked the beginning of something more complex, how a community remembers, how trauma echoes through generations, and how an isolated crime becomes a haunting. TCRW.ITGO in 1952, when news of the diary and the excavation broke, old-timers in Taney County remembered Sheriff James Harmon, the original investigator from 1912. By then he had been dead more than 20 years, but his former deputy Richard Anderson was still alive, and he had something to say. Anderson revealed that Harmon had never been at peace with the Whitlock case, not in 1912, not years later, not even as an old man. He told Anderson privately that he feared he had failed Eliza, writing once that the law's limitations mean that sometimes justice must wait. Harmon had seen the freshly turned ground behind the house. He had seen the terror in Edward's eyes. He had seen a husband whose calm felt too deliberate. But with no evidence, no witness, and a county unwilling to open a scandal without proof, Harmon had been forced to close the case. The guilt followed him to his grave. Long before the Simmons discovered Eliza's diary, locals had whispered about the old Whitlock homestead. Teenagers dared each other to go there at night, and travelers reported hearing strange sounds, a woman crying, scraping beneath the earth, soft thumps like someone digging in the dark. Most chalked it up to Ozark superstition. Rural folklore grows naturally in places where the land carries long shadows and echoes travel strangely through hollows. But when Professor Alan Matthews from the University of Missouri visited the site in 1952, he noticed something remarkable about the acoustics. Standing where the cellar once stood, he dropped a stone into the shallow depression. Its impact echoed between the limestone bluffs like a whisper bouncing from tree to tree. He wrote in his field notes, "If a person had been digging here at night in 1911, 1912, the sound would have carried unnaturally far enough to become legend." Folklore, he suggested, was simply memory filtered through fear. Although Edward had died in World War II, Mary Coleman, lived long enough to be contacted by investigators in 1952. She insisted she remembered nothing, but her husband painted a different picture. Mary suffered from intense anxiety, severe claustrophobia, nightmares of a woman calling from beneath the floor, and inability to be near basements or root cellars, panic attacks, triggered by the sound of shovels or scraping dirt, her husband said. She loved our children fiercely, but a part of her always felt absent, as if she stayed behind in those hills. When Mary died in 1968, her son Robert found a hidden bundle of childhood drawings in her attic. Every picture echoed the same scene, stick figures standing above the ground, a woman lying beneath it, the earth drawn heavy and dark. One picture carried the label, in a child's shaky hand, "Mama sleeping." A psychologist who analyzed the drawings concluded she did not forget. She survived by burying her memories, just as her mother was buried beneath that house. Teach community muhet. 80 had Missy in the years after the discovery. Taney County began to reckon with its past. Historians, criminologists, and psychologists studied the case as a haunting example of how isolation and silence can enable violence. Dr. Lean Foster, who examined the case in 1980, wrote, "The Whitlock tragedy was not just a murder. It was a community failure, the product of a culture where privacy mattered more than protection. Neighbors had noticed Eliza's disappearance, Thomas's strange behavior, extra locks on doors, or digging the children's distress. But in the early 20th century Ozarks, a man's home was his kingdom, and to question what happened inside it was to break an unwritten law. Silence was considered respect. Distance was considered decency. And in that silence, Eliza disappeared without the world even blinking. Ajare vs. Biamawaringi. By the time the case was officially closed in December 1952, Eliza's death ruled a homicide, the perpetrator long dead. The Whitlock property had already passed into myth. Some said the land was cursed. Some said justice had been late, but not denied. Some said the Ozarks had finally let go of a secret it had carried too long. The diary was placed in the county archives. Eliza was buried in Springfield beside her family. But the story did not end there. Because the Whitlock case left behind something larger than a crime. It left a lesson about the dangers of isolation, the cost of silence, and the terrifying reality that sometimes the greatest horror is not what lurks in the woods, but what lives inside a locked house on a cold winter night. 40 years after Eliza Whitlock's final diary entry and decades after the cold earth closed over her body, the truth finally surfaced. But the end of the investigation was not the end of her story. Instead, her life, her terror, and her death became a haunting lesson woven into the fabric of Missouri Ozark history. This last chapter is not about the crime itself, but about what the crime revealed, about a culture, a time, and a silence that allowed unimaginable suffering to stay hidden for generations. The local historian Margaret Branson, writing in 2012 on the centennial of Eliza's disappearance, captured the essence of this tragedy with terrible clarity. Thomas Whitlock buried his wife twice, once in the ground, and once in the story he told the world. For decades, neighbors, authorities, even Eliza's own children, lived under the shadow of a lie. The narrative of a wife abandoning her family was easier to accept than the possibility of something monstrous happening behind locked doors. Easier, but false. And because that lie was easier, it was believed. The Whitlock case became known among criminologists as a textbook example of how isolation protects abusers. In the early 20th century Ozarks, distance was both literal and cultural. Homesteads sat miles apart. Neighbors minded their own business. Domestic matters were seen as sacred, private, untouchable. Even when warning signs appeared, Thomas's agitation in town, the unusual digging, the boarded windows, the children's odd behavior, those signs were swallowed by a culture that hesitated to interfere. Sheriff Harmon himself embodied this dilemma. He suspected the truth in 1912. His private notes made that clear. But without evidence, he was trapped by the limitations of the law and the expectations of the community. In his heart, he knew something was terribly wrong. In his job, he could do nothing. The aftermath of the crime did not end on the day Eliza died. It lingered for decades in the minds of the two children who lived above her hidden grave. Edward, haunted by sounds only he seemed to hear, whispered in school, "She's still digging." He died young in a war far from home, carrying secrets he never fully spoke aloud. Mary, who lived into adulthood, showed every sign of childhood trauma, buried deep panic attacks, nightmares, aversion to basements, terror at the sound of digging, and a distant, unreachable sadness. Her childhood drawings, discovered after her death, revealed what memory had tried to hide: a woman beneath the earth, a child watching from above, and the unbearable truth that she had known even if she could never say it. Mary survived, but part of her never left that valley. Historians, touch get to us over the decades, Scholars dissected the Whitlock case to understand how a woman could vanish for 40 years without anyone forcing the truth into the light. Dr. Samuel Herz, reviewing the case in 1960, concluded that Thomas Whitlock likely suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, mirroring the illness that had claimed his father. His delusions grew quietly, privately, until Eliza became the center of imagined threats only he could see. Criminologists later called the case an example of an invisible homicide, a crime so effectively concealed by geography, culture, and mental illness that the world did not even realize it had occurred. Professor Matthews, who visited the property in the 1950s, believed the land itself held part of the story. The acoustics, the isolation, the shape of the valley, all of it created an environment where a crime could happen without a single witness. You could say the Ozarks themselves kept this secret, but secrets like this have weight. They bend the land, they stain the air. Someone, someday, always finds something. It wasn't justice delivered by law. It wasn't confession delivered by the killer. It wasn't even the children who exposed the truth. It was the land. The very place Thomas trusted to hide his crime betrayed him. A collapsed cellar, a diary preserved by cold limestone soil, a hairbrush buried in the wrong place, and a story that rose like a ghost through the cracks of time. Eliza's life ended in terror. Her death was hidden. Her memory was twisted by the man who killed her. But in the end, the truth surfaced. Her voice, once silenced, found its way back through ink, through soil, through dreams, through investigators who refused to look away, and through a community finally willing to face what had been buried. The Whitlock case became more than a tragedy. It became a lesson about the danger of unchecked isolation, the cost of silence, the legacy of trauma, and the way truth can survive even the darkest grave today. The land where the Whitlock home once stood is quiet, part of a recreational area few visitors think twice about. But when dusk settles and the wind moves through the hollow, locals say the sound carries strangely. Some say you can hear weeping. Some say you can hear digging. Some say it is only the wind in the limestone hollows. But for those who know the story, the sound is a reminder, a voice calling across a century, a truth that refused to stay buried, and a woman who, at last, was found.